The man with the briefcase doesn't know he's about to die. He steps out of the bank and into the bustling streets of Medellin, Colombia, his cash safely tucked away. He doesn't notice the two men stalking him, their pupils wide, their hands twitching. They've been trailing him for a block, high on cocaine and clonazepam, their .38 specials pressed against their stomachs. A hand suddenly clamps onto his shoulder. He barely has the time to turn before he's yanked into a dark alley. The man's voice cracks as he begs for his life. Tears blur his vision, but his killers are remorseless. They put a bullet through the back of his head, and the man slumps to the ground. Later, the killers will learn what the man's life was worth: $25 each. The two assassins aren't seasoned pros. They're just 14 years old. Tiny and Mouse, a duo of 4-foot sicarios, kill for pennies and a fix, supplied by the cartel's bosses they call jefe. But how do you turn a child into a killer? And why would the world's most powerful cartels trust their dirtiest work to kids? Find out in today's episode of the Infographics Show how a 14-year-old became the most evil hitman. In 2002, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and poet Eliza Griswold traveled to Colombia for the New York Times, where she spoke with Tiny, just 14 at the time, about his life as a cartel assassin. He was small and skinny for his size, a mixed result of malnutrition and cocaine addiction, but his slight frame made him the perfect killer, one no one ever saw coming. It was an advantage that had already claimed a number of lives. Tiny's very existence is a loophole for his cartel masters, an exploitation of Colombia's 1989 Minors Code, a law meant to protect children from the brutal adult prison system. It focused on restorative justice, giving juvenile offenders a second chance. But in practice, the underfunded justice system and overcrowded facilities became a revolving door for young offenders. Minors who had committed murder frequently found themselves right back on the street. And when you put children effectively above the law, they become the perfect assassins for powerful organizations like the Colombian drug cartels. One Medellin homicide detective, Captain Luis Francisco Marino Flores, even explained that these children were often more effective assassins than their adult counterparts. They're less predictable, and they know they can't be touched, he explained. We have kids who we know have murdered 10 to 15 people, but nothing happens to them. Griswold spoke to another teenage hitman in the La Floresta juvenile holding facility who showed a blank-eyed lack of remorse for his crimes, saying, "When you kill somebody, you don't feel anything." He was only a few years older than Tiny at 17, but he had clearly already been broken by the awful work he had done. Tiny had been killing since he was 12. He learned the trade under a 17-year-old assassin, both of them carrying out orders from local cartel dons. Tiny's initiation was to kill a bazuquero, a drug addict whose inability to pay and tendency to steal had made him unpopular with the locals. And drug dealers are only interested in drug addicts when they have the cash to pay for their merchandise. The duo caught the bazuquero mid-robbery. Tiny didn't hesitate. He pulled out a borrowed .32 revolver and shot him dead. For junior sicarios still proving themselves, every job is a test. Cartel bosses loan them a gun for each job. If they prove themselves killing without question, the bosses might buy them a gun of their own, just as they did with Tiny. Tiny and Mouse often sat in the yard of a local one-legged man who cooked meals for the boys. They would share a joint together, knowing that their connections and fearful reputations made them untouchable. Tiny even had a friend on payroll to keep tabs on the local rumors about him and to make sure that people were afraid. Tiny was like an old soul trapped in a young body, and with a life like his, it was no surprise. The only non-criminal adult in his life was his mother, but the truth was his father was just a deadbeat, living 100 miles away from the family he abandoned. Tiny never knew him. In his absence, Tiny was forced to become the man of the house. And in the poorest parts of Medellin in the early 2000s, one of the largest employers were violent drug gangs. These gangs were powerful, well-armed, and ruthless, thanks to backing from the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, or AUC. The group allied with the local gangs to fight guerrilla militants, offering them impunity in return. That protection allowed them to commit horrific acts, including turning children into killers. But really, Tiny was just a child. Most of the time, he would spend his days watching cartoons, waiting for the call from his bosses to go claim another life. Usually the payment was $250 per assassination. Sometimes the target was a cartel enemy, other times an ordinary person, someone a civilian paid to have killed. One man that Tiny killed was just a local loudmouth whose salacious blabbering was threatening a woman's marriage, so she paid to have him murdered. Not that Tiny and Mouse always saw that money. Sometimes their bosses would simply not pay them. Even after they had stained their souls with more blood, their bosses joked about it to their faces. After all, they had no recourse. They were expendable. Any kid who complained about unfair pay would likely be murdered anyway. there's always another little boy who will take their place, one who is more violent, more obedient, and more easily plied with pharmaceuticals and cocaine. And Tiny wasn't ignorant to this sad fact of his life. One of Tiny's bosses knew that he liked money. If he was asked to do something, he would do it, and that's all they needed. Real-life assassins aren't superlative fighters and weapons experts like John Wick and Leon. They're expendable fall guys who are good at doing what they're told. And who could be more expendable to those rich criminals than poor kids from the Medellin slums? Tiny's life as an assassin naturally put stress on his relationship with his family. His mother was dismayed at the violence, the risk to Tiny's life, and the fact that he often came home drunk and high, carrying weapons. In the early days of the job, she tried to talk him out of it, but her tune soon changed as she realized it was hopeless. By 2002, she was telling him to just listen to his bosses, hoping that obedience would keep him safe, even if he was out there killing people. But his mother wasn't Tiny's only family. He had 3 sisters and a little brother, a brother that he was terrified would become another underage sicario. He even said that if he ever saw his brother doing the things that he did out in the streets, he would beat him to set him straight. If it was so awful that he didn't want his brother to get caught up in it, why didn't he try to escape himself? Tiny knew the rules. If you were not with the gangs, you're against them. Turning on your former employers was a death sentence. He was trapped, stay in, or die trying to leave. His only hope was a way out beyond his control, some systemic solution that could free him from the cycle of violence. For Tiny's sake, it had to happen before it was too late. Unlike the dead-eyed 17-year-old assassin in La Foresta, Tiny still had enough empathy for his victims to be haunted by his crimes. Remember the blabbermouth who had a hit put on him for spreading the marriage-threatening rumors? After Tiny murdered him, he saw him in his dreams. In one dream, the murdered man even kissed Tiny's feet, and the young murderer woke up crying. Tiny couldn't sleep after that. He tried to push the image from his mind, but deep down he knew the victim was there because of him. But it's not just one neighborhood in Colombia, and this isn't just a tale of a tragic duo of boys forced into a horrible life. In reality, violent drug cartels employing assassins as young as 11 years old never stopped. In fact, it is getting much worse. In December 2010, panic erupted in Cuernavaca Airport in Mexico. A 14-year-old boy traveling with his 2 sisters was caught with 2 handguns in his luggage, as well as a pack of cocaine. He was trying to catch a plane to Tijuana on the border of California in the United States. When the boy and his sisters were arrested, it was discovered that his name was Edgar Jimenez Lugo, and he had a truly nightmarish story to tell. He had another name, El Ponchis, the Cloak, and just like Tiny before him, he had been a hired killer since he was 11 years old, with methods even more cruel and brutal than his Colombian gun-wielding colleague. Unlike Tiny, El Ponchis liked to work with blades. But stranger still, it soon came to light that Edgar and his sisters were American-born. They came from a broken home in the 1990s in San Diego, where his mother and his father were constantly arguing. The home was judged to be so unstable that Child Welfare Services removed them and sent them to live with Edgar's grandmother in the town of Huitepec, Mexico. This might have seemed like a reprieve from a terrible life, and it was until Edgar's grandmother died in 2004, and he was forced to drop out of school to support himself and his sisters. They lived in abject poverty and did whatever they could to survive. Life was already brutal, but then it got worse. The children were kidnapped by a well-known cartel enforcer who felt like taking on an apprentice. Under the enforcer's duress, Edgar helped carry out kidnappings, and then he became a tool for brutal executions. The enforcer got Edgar high on marijuana and then forced him to commit murders against the cartel's captured enemies on camera. Authorities also believe that one of Edgar's sisters was made to help dispose of the bodies that Edgar and others left in their wake. The enforcer motivated him using the carrot and stick method. Sometimes he was paid $200 a week in both dollars and pesos for his role in the crimes. But if he ever defected, just like with Tiny, the enforcer made it clear he would meet a gruesome and painful death. While being interrogated by the military police, Edgar said, "I feel bad doing it. I was forced to do it. They said they would kill me if I didn't do it." Between 2006 and 2010, there were approximately 28,000 casualties in Mexico attributed to the wars between the cartels and Mexican law enforcement. This had grown to around 80,000 by 2013. Authorities claimed at the time that the cartel violence and drug offenses committed by children and teenagers were also on the rise, from around 480 in 2006 to 810 in 2009. So why the sudden increase in violence, including the use of children and tweens to carry out some of the violence? The rapid spike was intrinsically tied to a push for expansion by the ruthless drug lord Hector Beltran Leyva, the new leader of the South Pacific Beltran Leyva cartel. This was an extremely dangerous organization whose power went to the highest levels of government in Mexico. But even this doesn't sell just how dangerous these people are. You may not know that Beltran Leyva name, but you know the name of their former ally turned rival, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, then the head honcho of a widely known and feared Sinaloa cartel. However, the four Beltran Leyva brothers were some of the few gangsters crazy enough to go up against El Chapo, which they did after one of them, Alfredo, got arrested by the Mexican military special forces. The Beltran Leyva brothers blamed El Chapo for Alfredo's incarceration, and they wanted revenge. Edgar Guzman Lopez, the 22-year-old son of El Chapo, had just left a shopping center and was getting into his SUV when a 15-man Beltran Leyva hit squad struck. They opened fire with assault rifles and grenade launchers, tearing Edgar apart. His corpse was left in a pool of blood on the asphalt. The ruthless Beltran Leyva brothers then splintered from the Sinaloa cartel and set up their own gang, the aforementioned Beltran Leyva cartel. They quickly formed alliances with some of the more established drug runners in the region, including Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel. Hector took the reins of the cartel after the former leader, his brother Arturo, was killed in a confrontation with the Mexican Navy. And Arturo, it turned out, was actually the nicest of the brothers because Hector made the cartel more violent than it had ever been before. There was a rise in kidnapping, torture, and assassination, even against Mexican government officials. They were sending a message, "Do not mess with us." But all of the cartels were killers. They needed a unique selling point to really shock their enemies and their would-be victims, hiring young. If you know anything about drug cartels other than becoming filthy rich by selling drugs to hundreds of millions of eager buyers, it's that their approach to violence is as horrific as it is theatrical. It's not because their agents are sadists, though many of them certainly are, but because they're all involved in a sophisticated public relations war against each other and law enforcement. It's why you so often see news stories and videos about their murderous exploits. They want you to know all this about them. And Edgar's tragic career as a cartel assassin had plenty of violent theater. A video of him decapitating a man with a machete was posted to YouTube. Many photos and videos documented his other murders, including the 4 slit throats that he'd eventually later confessed to. But the murders weren't the end of the indignity. The 4 men whose throats Edgar had slit had their heads cut off and their bodies hanged by their ankles from a local bridge as a warning against their enemies. And in one particularly gruesome case, a cartel agent entered a disco with a severed head in his hands, and it rolled out onto the dance floor. No act of violence is too low as long as it achieves their intended goal, to rule through intimidation and fear. While Edgar did confess to the murders, he strongly denied desecrating any of the bodies afterwards. He said, "I only beheaded them, but I never hung their bodies from bridges, never." This was a story that shocked and horrified the people of Mexico, as well as citizens abroad. In 2010, the then 15-year-old Edgar was sentenced to 3 years in a juvenile facility, the maximum sentence for a minor in Morelos State, where he was arrested and charged. Edgar went to prison without resistance. While behind bars, he seemed to clean up his act and even learned how to read, showing promise to the officials overseeing him. A little less than 3 years later, he was let out under heavy guard a few days early for good behavior. Now 17 years old, he was nicknamed Boy Assassin by the Mexican media. Plans were drawn up for him to return to the U.S., where he would stay with a family member in San Antonio, Texas. Naturally, this led to some controversy, given that some Americans were nervous about the idea of a person who had been a hardened killer since he was 11 years old walking through the streets among them. But strangely enough, Edgar might have been in more danger than any of the people who feared being around him. Between 2011 and 2013, 12 kids were released from juvenile detention after working for the cartel. Within weeks, sometimes even days, they were murdered by their former employers. Sending Edgar back to the U.S. might have been the only way to save his life and give him any hope of a better future. Michelle Lee, an FBI special agent based in San Antonio, said of the situation, "Apparently, he paid his debt for whatever crimes he was convicted of. The situation with him is really no different than any other U.S. national who commits a crime, completes their sentence, and is released. And beyond the uniqueness of Edgar's age at the time of his crimes, it seems that there was nothing all that unusual about him. He was a model prisoner and now on a positive path." In the 12 years since Edgar was brought back to the U.S., there have been no further incidents involving him that ever made the news. Maybe the reports of his rehabilitation were perhaps true all along. Without a cartel enforcer there to pay him, drug him, and threaten him with violence, murder has not remained a consistent behavior for the former child assassin. How the stories of Tiny and Edgar Laponchis Lugo end in the long run is still an open question. Will their stolen innocence someday be returned? In adulthood, might they find redemption for the terrible things they've done or had been forced to do? But for one dark insight into the future of many of the cartel's teen assassins, we only need to look at the tragic incident of Jose Armando Moreno Leos. He was a 13-year-old boy who in 2013 was captured by police in Zacatecas, Mexico. Jose confessed to having murdered 10 people on behalf of the cartel, claiming that he was also skilled with high-caliber weapons. The only person who came to the courtroom on the day of his trial to speak on his behalf was his own mother, a poor woman who claimed that Jose had left home when he was 11, and she had completely lost control of him since then. It's unsurprising that once again the cartel preyed on broken families in a state of economic desperation to recruit an underage assassin. The judge released Jose because Mexican law prohibited him from incarcerating someone below the age of 14. Mere weeks later, Jose met his own grisly end. 7 corpses were found on the side of a highway in Morelos, one of which was Jose himself. All of the people had been killed execution-style with high-caliber weapons, and their bodies showed evidence of torture before the murders took place. One of the female bodies in the pile is also believed to be Jose's mother, who paid in blood for the life that her young son had led. Those who live by the sword still seem to die by it, and children are no exception. What do you think drives kids into this life? Is it poverty, fear, or something even darker? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now check out what happened when Italian hitman fails to complete the job, or watch this instead.